Tess Siegel was a 20-year-old sophomore at the University of Florida who last year joined fellow activists at a campus protest calling on the university to divest from weapons manufacturers who are supporting Israel. Law enforcement arrived and ordered protesters to leave. Tess was arrested and held overnight in jail, allegedly for resisting arrest without violence. She said she never heard the order to leave, and her case was later dismissed. The university, however, banned her from campus, citing tough new restrictions on protests. A university disciplinary committee ruled that she had not acted in a disruptive manner, but she was nevertheless suspended for 3 years and must reapply after that, and she lost her scholarship. She now works in food service and doesn't know how or when she'll return to college. In an era in which students without U.S. citizenship are snatched off the street by federal agents in masks and held indefinitely in harsh prisons, sometimes just for publicly criticizing Israel, Tess's punishment may seem comparatively mild. But the irony here is that Tess is Jewish, active in Jewish life, an alumna of Jewish summer camp, and the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. Some politicians have demanded that universities protect Jewish students by punishing protests against Israel, calling such protests anti-Semitic. But given these politicians' stated concern for the welfare of Jews, why aren't they concerned about Tess and the thousands of other young Jews who are protesting Israel's conduct? Because over the past few years, some politicians, with the support of some American Jewish leaders, have done something extraordinary. They have redefined what it means to be a Jew. To silence condemnation of Israel, they have equated support for the state of Israel with Jewishness itself. And its corollary, denigration of the state of Israel, is denigration of Jews, usually called anti-Semitism. Few have articulated this redefinition of anti-Semitism more baldly than President Trump. In criticizing America's highest-ranking Jewish politician, Senator Chuck Schumer, for purported insufficient support of Israel, President Trump announced, quote, "Schumer is a Palestinian as far as I'm concerned. He's become a Palestinian. He used to be Jewish. He's not Jewish anymore." The president has also accused Jews who vote for Democrats as being disloyal to Israel, saying that these Jews hate their religion. Because Trump seems to believe he's more pro-Israel than Schumer or most American Jews, he apparently believes that he has the right to weigh in on the validity of one's Jewishness. He relies on the notion that Jewishness is defined by the degree to which one identifies with Israel and its current far-right government. The idea that support or lack thereof for Israel and its current government is what makes one Jewish or not is now being called pro-Israel anti-Semitism. And it has turned the definition of anti-Semitism on its head. This redefinition of Judaism and anti-Semitism is hardly limited to the president. Republican congresspersons recently grilled university presidents, accusing their institutions of being riddled with anti-Semitism for their failure to shut down protests critical of Israel. Alleged concern for the safety of the Jewish community has been the stated motivation for cutting millions in federal funding to Columbia, Harvard, and elsewhere. The administration is investigating over 60 universities and colleges on suspicion of tolerating or encouraging this kind of anti-Semitism, namely protests against Israel's government. Thanks to the New York Times, we recently learned that the ideology behind this comes from something called Project Esther, a think tank associated with the far-right Enterprise Institute and Project 2025, and most of its leaders are evangelical Christians. Some American Jewish groups recently put out a statement criticizing these actions. They said, and I quote, "In recent weeks, escalating federal actions have used the guise of fighting anti-Semitism to justify stripping students of due process rights when they face arrest and/or deportation, as well as to threaten billions in academic research and education funding. Students have been arrested at home and on the street with no transparency as to why they are being held or deported, in certain cases with the implication that they're being punished for their constitutionally protected speech. The statement goes on, these actions do not make Jews or any community safer. Rather, they only make us less safe. We reject any policies or actions that foment or take advantage of anti-Semitism and pit communities against one another, and we unequivocally condemn the exploitation of our community's real concerns about anti-Semitism to undermine democratic norms and rights, including the rule of law, the right to due process, and/or the freedom of speech, press, and protest. As The Atlantic's Jonathan Haidt explains it, he said, the campaign to use anti-Semitism as a justification to extend political control over universities has nothing to do with protecting Jews and everything to do with undermining liberal democracy. In a recent sermon on the subject, my well-known colleague Rabbi Sharon Brous said, this is not going to protect Jews. We're being used. Anti-Semitism has been hijacked. Perhaps ironically, this redefinition of Jewishness has allowed for harsh crackdowns on American Jewish activism, including impacting people like Tess and many of her fellow Jewish students. Jews have taken a leading role in the protests against Israel's policies in Gaza. Jewish Voice for Peace, wearing shirts that said "Not in Our Name," occupied a congressional building and led a takeover of New York City's Grand Central Terminal. Recent polls found that roughly 2/3 of American Jews disapprove of Netanyahu's performance as prime minister. 38% of American Jewish adults under the age of 40 consider Israel an apartheid state and believe that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Some protests consist of solely Jewish students. These protesters care deeply about their Judaism, many incorporating Jewish ritual and prayer into their protests. Not only does this redefinition of Judaism render so many young active Jews who oppose Israel's current government as anti-Semites, by the way, I guess I'm an anti-Semite as well, and most of my rabbinic colleagues, but it also normalizes and whitewashes what we used to consider anti-Semitism. While allegedly condemning anti-Semitism, the president has often invoked anti-Semitic tropes about Jews and money, using imagery like Stars of David with money in campaign materials, and famously said that there were very fine people on both sides of the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville that included anti-Semitic chants. The examples seem endless and are hardly limited to the president, but have become a staple of MAGA ideology. For example, Elon Musk gave 2 apparent Nazi salutes at Trump's inauguration, a gesture top advisor Steve Bannon later repeated. The administration hired a Pentagon spokesman with a long history of promoting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Top MAGA podcasters have hosted many guests with long track records of embracing anti-Semitic ideas and conspiracy theories. They've given voice to Hitler apologists Darryl Cooper and Kanye West, whose song glorifying Hitler has now gotten millions of hits on X. Some congresspersons who grilled university presidents in these congressional hearings on anti-Semitism are associated with calls for Jews to convert to Christianity, have quoted Hitler or supported Nazi and white supremacist groups in their districts. For example, New York's Elise Stefanik, who chaired that committee, backed a political candidate who praised Hitler as, quote, the kind of leader we need today. Our own Senator Tim Sheehy retweeted anti-Semitic memes and employed a neo-Nazi staffer, and when Montana rabbis got together and called him out, he refused to respond. I don't want to pretend that this new form of anti-Semitism is coming only from the political right. Just a few weeks ago, a New York colleague of mine, who is just as critical of Israel's government as I am, was walking home from synagogue in New York on Pride Day, and he stopped to observe the Dyke March. There were chants of "Down with Zionists." He was wearing his yarmulke, and several marchers accosted him, saying, "This means you, Jew." So some on the left are also equating Jewishness with support of Israel and holding it against all Jews. One of the most classical memes of anti-Semitism is called the dual loyalty meme. There's a whole room in the Holocaust Museum in DC that's devoted to it. Nazi propaganda heavily utilized this dual loyalty trope, falsely accusing Jews of having primary allegiance to a global Jewish agenda rather than to the nations in which they reside, rendering them untrustworthy and even traitors. This was key to portraying Jews as a fifth column undermining Germany from within and justifying their persecution and eventual extermination. Today, this new pro-Israel anti-Semitism has doubled down on this anti-Semitic dual loyalty meme. It claims that not only are Jews loyal to Israel rather than their home country, but loyalty to Israel is the very definition of being Jewish. And therefore, opposition to Israel's policies is anti-Semitism directed at Jews. So, and I'm going to say this slowly because it's mind-boggling, Jews who criticize Israel's policies, likely the majority of American Jews, are now seen as disloyal to Israel and therefore are anti-Semites. And according to MAGA, we hate our religion and are no longer Jews. I'm going to repeat that. Jews who are criticizing Israel's policies, likely the majority of American Jews, are now seen as disloyal to Israel and therefore are anti-Semites. And according to Trump and MAGA, we hate our religion and are no longer Jews. No longer are those who accuse us of being too loyal to Israel the anti-Semites. Rather, if we're insufficiently loyal, we are anti-Semites. Anti-Semitism has been flipped on its head. It's been hijacked. This new pro-Israel anti-Semitism is a simultaneous embrace of the Jewish state and attack on the majority of Jews' place in American life. Pro-Israel anti-Semitism has quietly become an essential part of the MAGA movement in America and a major part of right-wing parties in Europe. In this pro-Israel anti-Semitism, far-right parties' top leadership takes staunchly pro-Israel and anti-Muslim positions, using both to frame itself as a defender of Jewish interests, which it seems is the same as Israel's interests, and at the same time, they deploy anti-Semitic dog whistles and permit the spread of poisonous anti-Semitism throughout the party rank and file. The result is the mainstreaming of right-wing anti-Semitism by a party that claims to be standing up for Israel and the Jewish people. As in most things, this new ideology is grounded in something much older. The Bible says that God gave the land that is now Israel, as well as much of the surrounding land, to the Jewish people. For those Jewish fundamentalists who read that as historical truth, called religious Zionists, following God's stated will is essential to what it means to be a Jew. So for them, any action which undermines the Jewish ownership of Israel is an attack on Judaism itself. Historically, however, this religious Zionism has been a fringe group. Recently, however, we've seen it on the rise with fundamentalist religion more generally. It's no surprise that Christian fundamentalists would also see it this way. It's worth noting that religious Zionism is very different than secular Zionism. The latter grows out of the 20th century movements in Europe, where it was believed that every people should have a homeland, and the Jewish people were no different. After the Holocaust, the imperative grew, but unlike religious Zionism, secular Zionism allows for a democratic homeland that allowed for non-Jews as citizens. Secular Zionism is often still part of the Jewish experience, but not necessarily the core essence of what it means to be Jewish. Given the redefinition of anti-Semitism and its position as part of the MAGA movement, as I began my third legislative session this year, I worried about how this newfound pro-Israel anti-Semitism would manifest in Helena. And for me personally, as the only rabbi serving in any state legislature in the United States. On the one hand, I've always vocally stood up against the neo-Nazi literature, the anti-Semitic memes in social media, and the Christian nationalist movement efforts to cement America as a Christian, white Christian nationalist country where Jews are but sojourners. But as a longtime staunch critic of Bibi Netanyahu and his right-wing allies, I am now liable to suffer the irony of the only elected rabbi to a state legislature being simultaneously labeled as anti-Semitic. So going into the session, there were 3 bills drafts that were requested, all by far-right legislators, for resolutions supporting Israel. I feared they would put me in a pickle, forcing me to either support this hard Netanyahu government or be labeled anti-Semitic. When the first was drafted, it said 3 things. 1, Israel had the right to exist. 2, it condemned Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran's terrorist attacks. And 3, it condemned anti-Semitism generally. The other 2 bills had yet to be drafted, but knowing the legislators, I suspected they would be far more incendiary. I had no objections to the contents of that first bill, except for what it omitted, namely a condemnation of Israel's actions against the people of Gaza. But on its face, it didn't say anything offensive. And rather than risking something far worse, I could live with what was said in that bill, even if incomplete. And so I decided in order to head off the other bills, to become a co-sponsor. The anti-Semitism that the bill sponsor had in mind, of course, was this new hijacked pro-Israel anti-Semitism. But it was written rather broadly, and I saw an opportunity to hijack it back by providing my insight into the historical lessons about anti-Semitism that Montana's legislature was trying to take away from other groups. Because of debate rules, which requires one to stick to the text of a bill, I had to be vague. But as you'll see from the clip that we're about to play of my floor speech on this bill, I think I made the pro-Israel anti-Semitic crowd wriggle in their seats a little bit. So, Kitty, let's look at my speech.
Is there a discussion? Representative Stafman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of this motion, and I thank the sponsor. As many of you know, I'm the only congregational rabbi, now Rabbi Emeritus, serving in any state legislature. During the 10 years that I led Montana's largest Jewish community, Congregation Beth Shalom in Bozeman, I sadly saw lots of anti-Semitism. I'll never forget the morning that I arrived at the synagogue and found a plastic bag of bloody pig entrails in the mailbox. I ran into the bathroom and lost my breakfast from the sickening realization that somebody hated my community that much. During those years, every couple of months, white supremacist groups placed hateful flyers in mailboxes, on porches, and car windshields in cities across Montana. Neo-Nazi groups doxed Jews in Whitefish so that both of my rabbinic colleagues there had to install expensive security systems in their homes. Today, there's tight security in Montana's synagogues, and rabbis have their local FBI agent on their speed dial. Recently, hate has been directed at Jews by some who oppose Israeli government policies. There are legitimate reasons that some might oppose those policies. Israel's a democracy where dissenting views are allowed. But when disagreement with Israeli government policies spills over to hatred of Jews, it becomes anti-Semitism. What I especially appreciate about this resolution is it doesn't seek to solve the problems in the Middle East or politicize anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism must be condemned whether it comes from the political right or the political left, and this bill properly makes no distinction. I so appreciate the sponsor for declaring that hate has no place in Montana. The resolution also connects anti-Semitism today with 2 millennia of persecutions, culminating in the Holocaust, where fully 1/3 of my people were murdered. If we want to stem the rise of anti-Semitism, it's important to consider how it gets a foothold and grows. I'll share 3 brief takeaways from the lead up to the Holocaust that we might think about in considering rising anti-Semitism today. The first takeaway is it never starts with Jews. First, they came after the disabled and the mentally ill, then LGBTQ people, then immigrants, and eventually Jews. All of us were considered undesirables and ended up in death camps. The second takeaway is it happened through duly enacted laws of Germany's legislature. These laws removed us from the military, the civil service, and public schools. They protected the right of others to discriminate against us. We were prohibited from being in public places. We could not employ German women because they said women needed to be protected from us. Laws dictated who we were allowed to love or not allowed to love. The government controlled what names we could use and what we couldn't use. Jewish books were burned and our arts banned, so others could not be influenced by us. The shared goal of these and other laws was to erase evidence of our existence, just as they erased our physical bodies. And the final lesson I want to share today from the Holocaust is the German word for the process that was used to pass these laws and take control of all institutions. The word is Gleichschaltung, which means bringing into line. It was an essential component to cleanse lawmakers and the civil service of all who were deemed to be insufficiently loyal to the party, done with incredibly proficiency. They all came into line, often against their personal moral convictions, to preserve their own standing in the party. Friends, this resolution is a great start, but the current situation calls for vigilance beyond mere words. Every generation of Jews initially believes it can't happen in our time and place. But I'm thinking a lot lately about the words of the Lutheran pastor Martin Neumeiler,
1 minute.
prominently displayed in the Holocaust Museum. He said, "They came for the trade unionists, but I was not in a union, so I did not speak up." He said they came for the next for the homosexuals, but I was not a homosexual, so I did not speak up. Then they came for the Jews, but I was not a Jew, so I did not speak up. And then they came for me, and there was nobody left to speak up for me.
Well, that was the best I could do. Every one of the Holocaust references I made to the laws that led up to the Holocaust coincided with a particular anti-trans bill which the Montana legislature had passed in a couple of weeks before that. And everybody in that room, almost everybody, realized that. One well-respected former military Republican legislator told me later that it was the first time in 4 sessions that he cried in the legislature. The Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader were sitting there, wriggling in their seats and asking one another, I could even overhear it, how do we stop them? How do we stop them? But they couldn't, because I was on the bill, and even if I hijacked it. In the end, I doubt I changed many minds. Some probably never even made the connections to which I was alluding. As right-wing, unqualified support for Israel's government condemns American Jews it sees as insufficiently loyal to Israel, and left-wing anti-Zionism condemns American Jews it sees as too loyal to Israel, we're increasingly squeezed into a no-win position. But by trying to tug back at this hijacking of anti-Semitism, at least I didn't betray Tess Siegel, and the many conscientious Jews have been made pawns in this ideological war. But I'm worried that as these two new forms of anti-Semitism grow, the middle will evaporate. Today I pray that we will all find the courage to stand up to this onslaught in whatever way we can. Hijack it back best we can. Thank you.